Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ash. I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective, and I'm feeling very honored to host tonight's panel discussion on Afrikan Wisdom, New Voices Talk Black Liberation, Buddhism, and Beyond. Before we dive in, for folks joining an event with us for the first time, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a 13-year-old worker-owned cooperative and radical bookstore in so-called Asheville, North Carolina, on the traditional lands of Cherokee people. We're a general interest bookstore, but are perhaps more widely known for our eclectic selection of titles related to feminism, queerness, social movements, and radical politics. If you're not local and haven't had a chance to check us out in person, our entire catalog is available for purchase on our website, and we ship all across the country. So if you haven't checked us out yet, I highly encourage that you do, and I'll drop links to the website in the chat. Firestorm is also a community event space where we host all kinds of workshops, screenings, discussions, and reading groups. However, since the start of the pandemic, we've transitioned entirely to an online virtual space, and we'll continue hosting virtual events like the one you are attending tonight until it is otherwise safe to do so. Right now, we're currently hosting a book club on Tuesday nights for Madibo Kadali's Pan-African Social Ecology, and we have another author event coming up next week on Friday, October 29th, with Indigenous scholar Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. So if you're interested in staying informed about those or other events happening through Firestorm, I'll also drop a link to our community calendar in the chat. A note for those of you who are attending on Zoom tonight, there will be some time at the end of tonight's conversation for audience Q&A. So for anyone interested in asking a question, I'll encourage you to submit questions throughout the discussion by using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen, and our speakers will do their best to respond. Great. Like I said before, tonight's event features a panel discussion between 3 contributing authors to Afrikan Wisdom, New Voices Talk Black Liberation, Buddhism, and Beyond. The book is a spiritual, political, and interdisciplinary collection of wisdom stories from today's Black liberation thought leaders and teachers. It includes 30 essays written by an eclectic group of inspirational authors who reflect on the unique experience of being Black in the world today and aim to instill readers with knowledge, awareness, validation, and spiritual tools needed to nurture their individual and collective liberation. Our moderator tonight is Vimalasara, who is also the editor of the book and a contributor to the anthology. Vimalasara is a public speaker and master trainer in the fields of conflict transformation, leadership, and mindfulness, and is also the award-winning author and editor of 9 books. Vimalasara, thank you so much for being here tonight and moderating our panel. And I'll go ahead and hand it over to you to introduce our panelists tonight.
Thank you. Are we recording?
Yes, it's being recorded.
Oh, it's being recorded. Okay. All right. Well, I should say that Afrikan Wisdom is my 10th book. Yeah. And I always say that every book that I birth into the world has to be better than the next. And definitely I've managed that this book is better than any other book that has preceded before it. And why? I think because this book brings together thought leaders from 3 countries, from Canada, the USA, and England. And I thought before I introduce the contributors, some of the authors in the book, that I would like to begin Well, firstly, I want to say where I am. I'm on the unceded territory of the Sechelt Musqueam Nation. And I just really want to acknowledge that, because that was the land that supported me as I was working on this book. And I just want to say thank you to all of you who are with us on Zoom or on YouTube or on Facebook. You are in for a treat. So buckle up, relax, and let's begin the journey. So Ash, if you could begin the journey with the video first, please.
I am Africa, a galaxy of 54 countries, 9 territories, 2 disputed states, orating dialects of 3,000 overtures. I am language literate, language articulate, laughing, drumming, dancing, singing, a cappella voices telling my story. I am Africa.
My name is Valerie Mason-John, aka Vimala Sara, and I am the editor of Afrikan Wisdom, New Voices Talk, Black Liberation, Buddhism and Beyond. The book covers Buddhism, and beyond Buddhism, it covers Christianity, it covers Islam, it covers Rastafarianism, it covers the life of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, it covers work taking the Buddhist teachings into the prisons, it covers topics of social justice. There's a whole section on decolonizing mindfulness, Black liberation, looking at Black Lives Matter. I chose to focus on the scattering of Africa in the US, Canada and England because I'm firstly connected to all those 3 countries. I was raised in England, I lived in the US and I now live in Canada. And secondly, I really see that this book is the beginning of a volume, a whole series of books looking at the African wisdom in the diaspora.
I am Africa, polished by the sub-Saharan sun, blue-black, brown-black, red-black, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, swimming in my jeans, swinging in my hips.
And for me, it was really important not necessarily to reach out to established writers or established authors, but to reach out to people who perhaps were established in the certain topics that I wanted to cover. All the contributors are of African descent. And the reason why this book, Afrikan Wisdom, is because in the diaspora, we're often bombarded with many wisdom teachings, but they are often appropriated actually, and many of these wisdom teachings that we know of actually do come from African traditions. There is so much wisdom in Africa, and wisdom that isn't privy to the foreigner, isn't privy to the white Western world.
Ashe. Ashe.
In Africa, Africans do not have to think, where do they come from? They know where they come from. It's only when they step into the diaspora that they become something different. They become a color. It's a gift from the 34 contributors, a gift from myself as an editor,
bringing all those contributors together. And what I want you to know is that the royalties from this book will be donated to an organization that focuses on the uplift of African descent people. Go out there. This book is available from all good bookstores and, of course, online. I am Africa, the mother of all peoples, the mother of all nations, birthing the first humanoid, civilizing the first society, robbed of my riches, compensated with poverty, infant mortality, war, famine. I am Africa. What is there left to take? Africa? Africa? You can never take Africa. Africa is the spirit always roaming in my continent. I am Africa, 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 Africa.
Okay, well, firstly, what I'd like to say, can you spotlight me, Ash? Thank you. Okay, so firstly, what I'd like to say is that the royalties are actually going to be donated to an organization called the Mission of Peace at Any Pace, which is an organization offering healing opportunities through culturally specific journeys. And this organization actually offers healing journeys for African descent people, taking them through an ancestral journey of the slave route in the US. So I'm just really delighted that that the royalties of this book will go to help heal African descent people. So what I want to say is that this book actually came out of a most amazing container. It came out of a conference which was for Black Buddhist teachers and Black Buddhist scholars. And it was the most amazing experience. There were perhaps 90 of us together for a week. It was the first time so many of us were together, and we were graced by the presence of Jan Willis, Alice Walker, and Angela Davis. And then we swelled to over 300 people at the weekend of African descent people who were curious about the Dharma. So this is where the idea of the book came. And whenever you have an idea of the book, it changes. So the book doesn't just include the voices of Black Buddhist teachers. It includes the voices of African descent Dharma teachers, because Dharma means the truth. Buddhism doesn't have the monopoly on the word Dharma. So I want to say that actually all the authors in this book are Dharma teachers within their lineage. And this book actually, the conception of this book was pre-pandemic. And then, of course, working on it was during pandemic. And there was this point thinking, oh my God, I have to have something, a chapter around the Black bodies that hadn't been included. And so I reached out to Sensei Alex Kakuyo at the 11th hour saying, Alex, can you write me a chapter on this topic? And he graciously said yes and turned it around for me in a matter, I think, of 3 or 4 days. So I'm going to introduce Alex Kakuyo. And Alex, if I mispronounce your name, please say it for me when we bring you on. Is a Buddhist teacher and breathwork facilitator, A former Marine, he served in Iraq and Afghanistan before finding the Dharma through a series of happy accidents. And I'm so glad that you had some happy accidents and that you found the Dharma. In fact, you know, just reading that you was in Iraq and Afghanistan, and just the trauma of that, let alone the trauma that you were born into, but the trauma of that. Alex is the author of Perfectly Ordinary Buddhist Teachings for Everyday Life. So if we could spotlight Alex and bring Alex in, that would be great. I'm not seeing spotlight. I'm not, maybe you can't spotlight on webinar, but over to you, Alex.
It will spotlight the speaker, just so you know.
Thank you so much for that great introduction. I'd first like to give deep honor and praise to Vimalasara for bringing me in and inviting me to be part of this process and this project, to my fellow contributors for their wonderful essays, which I enjoyed reading, and also to Firestorm Books for hosting this event. It's very kind of them. And my essay was entitled Purification and Protest: The Murder of Black Bodies in America. And the reason I wrote about that is I was thinking about what was happening around the murder of George Floyd, around the protests that were happening around the country, and the strange pushback that was happening in the larger diaspora of the country, that this shouldn't be happening, that we don't understand where this has come from. And it was strange to me. And I was having trouble putting into words why it was strange to me, why people were so surprised by the outrage around this man's murder. And what came to me, that this is very similar to what happens with Buddhist retreats. So I, as a Buddhist teacher, spent a lot of time in Buddhist temples. I've been in many retreats, and people often have this misconception that a retreat is relaxing, that it's easy, that we're going to go in and there will be massages and good food and kind of a spa weekend type deal. But a Buddhist retreat is actually quite difficult and challenging for a number of reasons. We as Westerners aren't used to sitting on cushions or on the floor for hours at a time. So there's physical difficulties there. There's a strict schedule we have to follow, so we lose a lot of autonomy. And then also just the practice of seated meditation, when we lose all of our toys, all of our distractions, and we have to really sit with what's in our head, we don't always like what we find there. So retreats are wonderful because we always come out better on the other end, but we only come out better if we're willing to sit with that difficulty and with that trauma, with that karma that comes up, with having to do work practice and wash dishes and clean toilets that we haven't used, not being allowed to use our cell phones, etc. And when I think about this period of racial reconciliation that's happening, it's so similar to a Buddhist retreat, that I feel that people have this idea that everything's just going to come together and it's going to be simple and easy and clean, and we're going to hold hands and sing Kumbaya. And that's just not how the world works. When we look at the way that Black bodies and Indigenous bodies and Hispanic bodies and Asian bodies have been treated in our country, and the karma associated with that, karma doesn't just disappear. It grows, it ripens over time, and it has to go somewhere. We have to deal with it at some point. And that's what was happening with the murder of George Floyd. It was hundreds of years of karma all ripening at the same time. And I simply made the point in my essay that this is normal, frankly, should be expected. And if we want to come out better on the other end, then we need to be willing to sit with this trauma and with these difficulties that are coming forth. And I also wanted to make the point that, especially in Buddhist communities, we have this idea that we just shouldn't be involved in things of this nature. But in my view, as someone who acts as a chaplain for nonprofits and at protests and whatnot, being involved is integral to the practice. There's no way that we can honor and venerate the Buddha on our altar if we're not also willing to honor and venerate the Buddha in handcuffs, the Buddha in the homeless shelter, the Buddha that was George Floyd before he was murdered. So that's what my essay was about.
Thank you so much for that, for the clarity of that. And it's a brilliant chapter. They're all brilliant chapters. So yeah, just take a moment to pause as we move on. I have the privilege to work with Arisika. In fact, I see myself as a student of Arisika. I can remember the movement, the teaching of the movement that you did at that conference, which was so beautiful and was such an important teaching for me. And Arisika and I offer, along with another sibling, Alita, offer African wisdom and healing for African descent people the last Sunday of every month. And so I have the real privilege to be in Arisika's presence once a month. Arisika Razak, MPH, is a professor emerita and former chair of the Women's Spirituality Program at the California Institute of Integral Studies, is a core teacher at the East Bay Meditation Center in Oakland, California, and a graduate of Spirit Rock's Dedicated Practitioners Program. Her teachings incorporate diverse spiritual traditions, multicultural feminisms, and contemporary diversity theory. For more than 20 years, Arisika served as an inner city midwife, providing birthing care to women from more than 70 countries. She has facilitated spiritual workshops for more than 30 years and performed nationally and internationally as a spiritual dancer. Arisika is a regular contributor to books and journals and presents at numerous conferences on the subjects of womanism, diversity, women's health and healing, and embodied spiritual traditions. Her film credits include Fire Eyes and Who Lives, Who Dies. So over to Arisika talking about her offering in this book.
So I'd like to say that my offering focused on the historical and contemporary legacies of African female-bodied people in diaspora. And I want to say that I use the term, I wanted to be gender expansive in that. So including women who were not cisgendered, who became women at some point in their life. And I wanted to begin by saying that, you know, to be born in the 20th century as I am, I'm 72 years old, is to really have been born at a time when women of African descent were still considered the mule of the world. And that our right to be seen fully in our empowerment was always in question. I was a young woman when the Moynihan report came out, in which what was said, this is in 1965, that the problem with the Black family really was that it was woman-led, that it was matriarchal, that it wasn't a two-parent family. And again, this debate about, you know, was this, and initially we wondered, you know, was this a heritage of slavery times when families were deliberately broken up, where a mother and child might stay together long enough for that child to be weaned, but might be sold. Suckling babies were taken off their mother's breast and given to someone else to wet nurse on the plantation. And that, you know, that was just such a traumatic incident. What I read is that after the ending of slavery, Black people walked up and down this country looking for their sundered relatives, trying to re-find the husband, the mother, the father that had been sold away. So certainly single parent households were not even really a legacy of slavery. But in fact, what carried through the Ma'afa, through this terrible disruption in which for 400 years or more Africans were taken from the continent, we came from lineages, especially in West Africa, where women were powerful. They had roles among the Yoruba in West Africa. There is a term, Iyalode, mother of the outside, in which it's recognized that women had roles as priestesses outside of the home, of priestly and spiritual authority. It was recognized that women among the Igbo and the Yoruba, for example, that women were the consummate traders. So that business acumen was a feminine trait. And that in many West African languages, there is no gender. So there's not a king and a queen. And in English, a queen is generally lesser than a king, except in some exceptional cases. But in Yoruba, there is one word for this. And one African theorist and scholar argues that we really don't even know how many of the Yoruba rulers were actually female-bodied because the names are generally spiritual. So we don't know from the name if they were male or female. So what I did in my work was really look at this tradition of empowerment that traveled from West Africa, that authority, that rightness of women to run households, to run businesses is not an aberration, is not a pathology. And also, while Africa is a country, is a continent and not a country, some things in which the belief and the development of systems of healing, of systems to deal with trauma, in which we literally invite spirit into the body, in which we use the healing of ritual, of singing, of dance, of music, to soothe our body, minds, heart, to endure trauma, to work in Africa as free people under the grueling sun, that often a drummer was hired who sang the praise songs of your ancestors. And that those traditions carried into the work song in the South, on the plantation, in the prison, on the work gangs, and to lift up those traditions which still exist today. And in terms of appropriation, you know, so much of our music, so much of so much of our vernacular, so much of the way that we are continually creative and inventive people gets picked up by the mainstream. It's bad when Black people do it, but when it's taken up by Euro-Americans, it's wonderful, it's hip. You know, I'm thinking of the fist bump when Biden was elected, you know, and how that seemed perfectly, he fist bumped Kamala Harris. And yet when Obama was elected, there was a caricature in the New Yorker in which showed Michelle and Barack fist bumping, and they were seen as outsiders, she with a large afro, he with a Muslim turban. And so this way that when we do it, it's sort of not quite American and suspect, but when somebody else does it, picks it up, it's fine. So I think I'm going to stop there and pass it on to our next speaker. And again, all my thanks to Vimala Sara and the brilliant writers in this anthology. And I do want to say, I'm coming to you from the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone lands in Oakland, California. All praises to the ancestors, all praises to the indigenous stewards of this land. Thank you.
Ashe. Yeah. Well, Karla, the first time I met you was on the flat screen. And I listened to your teachings on tricycle. Yeah, and was so inspired. In fact, it was wonderful. I think for me, you were one of the first, maybe the first Black teacher that I kind of saw on tricycle, and it was such a strong teaching. So I remember that's where I first met you, and what a wonderful way to meet you. And then just meeting you through your words, I just this chapter 2, it gave me goosebumps as I was reading this chapter. I just had the sense of the Buddhist teacher and the Dharma teacher. In fact, I was just come from a workshop, and Jan Willis was saying, you know, the Buddha was both the doctor and a teacher, and that's what we need as Buddhist teachers. It's not just a teacher and a doctor, and that's the sense I have of what I've got from you, from your teachings. So over to Karla Jackson-Brewer, MS, has been a Vajrayana practitioner and student of Lama Tsotrang Alyon for 32 years. She is a Tara Mandala authorized teacher who has been practicing Chod for 31 years. In October 2012, she received the Chod empowerment from His Holiness, the 17th Gaila Wang Karmapa Ogyen Trinle Dorje. And over to Karla.
Great, thank you so much. I have to say, it's so exciting for me to be in these conversations because it's so rich. What we share. I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the land of the Lenape people in New Jersey this evening. And I want to acknowledge all of my ancestors who have brought me to this moment. My chapter focuses on Vajrayana Buddhism, the manifestation, iteration of Buddhism that has come from the Tibetan people through the Tibetan lineage, and is a practice of Buddhism, like I guess all Buddhism, but takes everything on the path, the good, the bad, the happy, the sad. It's all part, it gives us opportunity to practice. It gives us opportunity to connect to our true nature. And so I was thinking, so my chapter is entitled Vajrayana Buddhism, a path of healing and liberation for people of African descent. When I think about structural oppression and the history of structural oppression, and I think about how much so many beings suffer, and particularly people of African descent, that what I found in Buddhism is this balm for suffering, is this way to sort of get out of the box. And you mentioned the Chud practice. The Chud practice is an ancient Tibetan, you could even think shamanic Buddhist practice, a mixture of the ancient Bon tradition and Buddhism that was really developed and brought to the world by an 11th century woman, Manchi Glapdron. Very unusual in that time. And yet she really worked this practice where we can cut through our attachment to what we think is most precious, right? Our bodies. And, it's like we're going to protect those. And Chud was an ancient healing practice. So Chupas and Chumas would go from place to place and heal epidemics, etc. Very powerful practice. And then another particular way in which healing can occur is through what are called mandala practices, where we're connected to what are often referred to as the five families. This way in which Vajrayana Buddhism provides a mechanism to not only work with physical healing, but with emotional healing. And so in the mandala practice, we are introduced to the wisdom expression in the five families, the wisdom expression of spaciousness, of equanimity, of mirror-like wisdom, of a discernment, of all accomplishing wisdom in these, and then also those encumbered emotions that are attached, connected to those, right? What we get to confront in the relative realm, and envy, pride, which really is more like poverty mentality, anger, those kinds of emotions that they get in the way. They block us. They block us in our evolution as humans. They also block us in our access or our path to enlightenment. And so working with these, I really saw like how beneficial this could be to individuals and communities of African descent, to be able to transform that encumbered emotion into the wisdom expression. And again, to connect to a sense of wholeness, a sense of centeredness, which I connect very much to the African continent. This sense of wholeness, this sense of each being is valued. And so to hear that my chapter, really gave you chills is like such an honor, because clearly, those energies were speaking through me. And that wisdom, that ancestral wisdom was speaking through me. So I'm going to stop here.
Thank you. And this is an invitation to the audience to just take a look at these beautiful beings on the screen and to just take each and every one of us in. So we're just going to pause and just invite you to take a look and appreciate these teachings and these beautiful beings before you. Okay, so I'm going to go off script. You've got a minute. I'm going to give you a minute each. What is African wisdom? What is African wisdom? We talk about African wisdom. For you, what does it mean for you, African wisdom? A minute. I'm not timing, so you got a minute. Who wants to pop first?
I will say that from my perspective, African wisdom traditions encompass a whole range of very diverse beliefs, practices, spiritualities, and experiences that have traveled from Africa throughout the diaspora, and that really give us some guidelines for how to live in harmony, in balance, how to heal. And so it can be the diverse traditions which are very embodied, whether they are in Black Pentecostal churches or the Orisha veneration that occurs all over the world. It can be the respect for elders. It can be, in some communities, the way that children, male, female, and other gendered, are esteemed. So there's no one African wisdom tradition. There are no two African wisdom traditions. But there is a whole foundation and fountainhead out of which we look at how we live, how we treat others, how we move forward in times of difficulty. Thank you.
Thank you. Somebody else.
Well, that's such a big question. And when I think about the continent of Africa itself, as was referenced in the video, and the countries and the disputed states and the languages and the religions, it's hard to say what is African wisdom. So I'll just say it's human wisdom. It's the coming together of our real human lived experiences with our families, with our friends, with our jobs, etc., and the tying together of that with our spiritual lives. It's the dual and the non-dual coming together.
Thank you.
Yeah, when I think of African wisdom, this, and coming after the two of you, it's like, oh yeah, that, oh yeah, that, oh that too. This weaving together of ancient knowledge, current knowledge, that is, as you said, embodied, transformational, there's something about wisdom that it makes me feel it's like reliant. I can lean on it. It's the voices, the solutions, the phrases that have passed from elder to youth to elder to youth to elder to youth. It's the the way in which people survive and really operate in a way that we're connected to each other. So African wisdoms for me also is about connection, and if we talk about interconnectedness, interdependence, it's that kind of that movement of energy, and there's something about it being grounded also in the earth.
Mhm. Thank you. As I listen to the three of you, what's percolating in me is the fear that people have had of our wisdom. And when I talk about that fear, if you think like at one point Egypt wasn't even considered Africa. I mean, I can remember looking at a map and thinking, where the hell is Egypt? And it's I think it's about 15 years ago that the British Museum fessed up. They had these stolen sculptures from Ghana, but they have been kept so long because they needed to prove that it was African people who had done that work, because they couldn't believe that as African descent people that we could produce such beautiful sculpted work. So this fear, I mean, it's mind-boggling, this fear. And in leading on from that, I'm aware that there will be people listening who aren't African descent. And one of the questions might be, well, what about, cultural appropriation? What can we, what can white people take from African wisdom is the question that I have for you. Yeah, is there a place for white people to benefit from African wisdom? Well, of course, yes, they benefited from our wisdom from memoriam, but yeah, who wants to pop?
As you were talking, I'm thinking that wisdom comes from so many different places, right? So people can access wisdom, but they can't act like it's their own. We need to have footnotes and to acknowledge where this wisdom comes from. So, for instance, if I'm learning wisdom or receiving wisdom from the Native American group, and really, it's like, or some other, it's like that wisdom comes from that culture, that tradition. And that even as I share that or use that, I have to acknowledge where that's coming from. It's not mine, right? So I think in some ways, I think that the world could benefit from some more African wisdoms. Definitely. So yeah, I think that people can access. There are, essays in this book that will touch people, that will touch people's hearts. And that goes across culture.
I had a minute with my computer. I want to talk a little bit about some of the physical, cultural issues that come up. So I'm thinking about dreads, for example, and wearing your hair in dreaded locks. And I actually remember a movie maybe 30 years ago with Bo Derek, who the young people may not even know who she is.
With the plaits, with the
braids. She a blonde woman who wore her hair in dreads. It's important to know that many Black people who want to be professional cannot wear dreads. If I have talked to nurses, they couldn't be hired as a nurse and wear dreads. I've talked to a hygienist who admired my locks and said, but I couldn't get a job with dreads. I want people to know that some of the things that they just think of, oh, it's just a hairstyle. It's not just a hairstyle. I just listened to a talk by Chimamanda Adichie in which and the title I think is, if Michelle Obama had had a natural, Obama would not have been elected president. And there is a real reality to this. So that when you look at things that are Black that you think you like, learn something about the history, learn something about the positionality. California, I think, is the first state, I don't know if it's the only, to have put in a law that says Black people cannot be discriminated against on the basis of wearing their own natural hair. There is such a bias about our hair when it is worn by people of African descent. If it's worn by white women, it's fine, it's trendy, it's hip, it's youthful, but when we wear our hair in styles that are made for our hair, we are some way anti-American, anti-white, and threatening. It's important to know this. It's also important to know that some of the people we esteem as wisdom figures actually were afraid of Blackness. Jung had dinner with a white American couple on the East Coast, Carl Jung, the psychiatrist, and talks about worrying. The servants were of African descent. He worried that their Blackness would run into his food. He talks about, there's an article, Your Negroid and Indian Behavior. If you can find it on the internet, it's by Jung. He talks about the pull of the primitive man and how the civilized man must always be on guard against it. He talks about Americans being infected by the Black people in the American midst. And I'm not saying we shouldn't study Carl Jung, but we should know that this anti-Blackness is part of what many Renaissance, many Enlightenment thinkers, and many people that we esteem had. These histories are important.
I just want to piggyback on what Karla said, because she just said it so beautifully. It's just, there needs to be footnotes. This conversation around cultural appropriation is so interesting to me, because the solution just seems so simple. It's just, where are you getting this knowledge from? What are your references? When I give talks, I'm always, well, this sutra says this, or this reverend offered this teaching. You name your sources, right? This is something you learn in school. You can't write a paper and not acknowledge the book you're quoting. And yet, for some reason, when it comes to culture, then everyone wants to pretend like they invented it themselves. We see this in Buddhism, where people honestly believe that Buddhism didn't exist in America until the 60s. It came here in the 1800s with Asian immigrants, yes. Japanese immigrants, Chinese immigrants, Cambodian immigrants, etc. And it was here for a long time before the hippies and the beatniks discovered it. But because people are so reticent to name their sources, to acknowledge who gave them these teachings to begin with, people honestly believe that, white people discovered Buddhism in America. And that's just hilarious to me. So we should all name our sources, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, thank you for that. So if any of you are listening and thinking, can I use anything from the book? Yes, and credit us and name the sources. Yeah. So, well, actually, there is I was going to move into a question, but I see that there is a question. I can't see it. Hold on. I think I'm in the wrong place. Okay. This is such a beautiful talk, and I'm so grateful for the perspectives each one of you are sharing. Thank you. My question is, how do you integrate your personal lineage with the lineage of your spiritual practices from other lands, such as Tibet? Do you celebrate each separately, or do they flow into one another? And let me see if I can cut and paste this so that you can actually see this. Oh, actually, if you click on Q&A, you can see it. Would somebody like to answer that? One of you like to answer that?
Go ahead, Alex.
So for me, this is a wonderful question because this is actually something I struggled with for a long time. And there is this idea in Buddhist centers that we have to stop being who we are in order to stop practicing the Buddha, in order to practice the Dharma correctly. So we have to give up our race, we have to give up our gender, we have to give up our sexual identity in order to be pure, good Buddhas. And that's not the case if you look at the sutras. What you find if you read the sutras is individuals using their identities in a skillful way, right? So we don't give up our race, we don't give up our sexual identity, etc. Instead, we take this part of us and we figure out, how can I use this part of myself to save all sentient beings from suffering?
Yeah.
So that's something that I do personally in my own life. If we understand the relationship between the conventional world and the absolute world, so the conventional is the world we live in, you know, the floor, the trees, the plants, etc., and the absolute is that which is beyond name and form. There's this idea that the absolute is the true reality or the good reality, and we should try to go there and ignore everything else. But if we understand that teaching correctly, the Brahmasnet Sutra says we must be emptied of emptiness, right? Meaning we have to go so deeply into the absolute that we come out the other side and realize the conventional isn't separate from it. In fact, they codepend and manifest from each other. So my integrating, you know, my lineage with my spiritual practice has been the practice of understanding, how can my race, how can my gender, how can my sexuality inform my spiritual practice, and vice versa, as opposed to trying to cut off one from the other.
Thank you. That's a beautiful answer. Does anybody want to add to that, or shall we move on? Yeah, it was a very, very beautiful, beautiful answer. So, Arisika.
I was going to yield to Karla because there was a question about Tibet, but I simply just want to simply say, I am a person of many identities. And I, you know, as someone once asked a teacher of mine, well, David, when you look in the mirror, do you see a Latino or do you see a man? And so for those of us whose identities are braided together, in some way, for me, all of these identities come together. That from what I learned from indigenous teaching is a reverence for the web of life in which we're embedded. And that's also in Buddhism. I learned from my African lineage the importance of female-bodied people, or female-identified people, or femme-identified people. So I take that into my practice of the Dharma. So it's not so much a separateness. And I think one of the ways that has been happening with shelter in place and the placing of so much on these internet platforms is that we've been discovering that for many of us who are Black people teaching the Dharma, that we use the ancestral practices. We bring more embodied ways of knowing into our teaching. But that's just what I'll say. I don't know if, Karla, you want to add anything.
Just, you both have spoken so wonderfully, but it is this idea of multiple identities. And I don't want people to think that there's some sort of mashing up of my spiritual traditions, because I also practice other traditions. But when I think about my lineage involves, well, there's my lineage, my blood lineage, right? And then there is my lineage of all my lifetimes. If we, work with reincarnation and past lives. So in some ways, that lineage and the practice, they inform each other. They dance with each other. And it is true that I bring my Blackness to my teaching. Sometimes you'll hear it in the way I talk, or the analogies I use, or it it comes in, and there's space for that. There's space for that. So yeah.
Well, I'm going to quote Pat Parker, the late Pat Parker, who wrote the letter to my white friend. And there's that quote where she says, you know, first you remember I'm Black, and second you forget I'm Black. And to me, it was such a strong teaching. To me, it's resonance of Dogen's teaching, the 12th century teacher and writer Dogen, who said to study the Buddha way is to study the self. And to study the self is to let go of the self. And to let go of the self is to be illuminated by a myriad of things. And I really love this because I really do, I know that I have loosened my attachment to identities, that they don't matter in the same way. And that's part of the integration. But to get to that, I had to learn to love all of that. You know, I had to learn to love all of that before I could begin to loosen the attachments to certain identities. And I love that you know, Alex, the Mahayana, that's it, is to use the Bodhisattva vow. Of course, you know, if we're going to help all suffering beings, we have to stay in this world, and to stay in this world, then we are going to have to use part of our identities to uplift people and to help liberate people. And at the end of the day, it's nothing is separate, is it? It's again, it's that I always think that whatever book that I write, it's not me who's written it, it's the ancestors who have written the book. You know, so much has come before me, you know, so much has come before me. Yeah. Okay, so just let's move into this topic of, is as all of us here are either Buddhist or Buddhish. Okay, not all the contributors would define as Buddhist or Buddhish, but as we all, it's an identity that we have. Is it a time for Black Sanghas? As you know, I wrote this article recently in Buddha Dharma. Is it the time for Black Sanghas? Is there a need for Black Sanghas? What do you think? What does that mean? So who wants the pop?
Well, I can start. I really liked the way Vimalasara in that article that you referenced Ambedkar, who did mass conversions. Ambedkar, and I may be mispronouncing his name, was contemporary of Gandhi's. They wanted to liberate India. And in fact, Ambedkar wrote much of the first Indian constitution after its emergence from under British colonialism. And one of the things is Ambedkar believed that the liberation of Dalit, what we may know as the untouchables, was not possible under Hinduism. And he saw Buddhism as a religion, a spiritual practice of liberation. And I think one of the things that we should be aware of is that Buddhist traditions are emerging all the time. That it's not simply that the Buddha, the historic Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, gave traditions and that they never changed. You know, one of the Nichiren Buddhist sect, there are, I think, 26 of them. Nichiren, I think, was either 13th or 11th century. And those groups are still proliferating. That in Japan, after World War II, a number of new Buddhist groups committed to peace emerged. So I think it's important to recognize that Buddhism spreads, it evolves, it takes on the flavors and the needs of the country that it's spread to. And certainly the notion that as African Americans, Isabel Wilkerson in her book Caste argues that the most prescient label terminology for understanding the way that African Americans in the USA are treated is to make the analogy with the untouchables of India. And Martin Luther King was actually introduced to a class once as an untouchable from America. And while he first resisted that identity, he came to claim it. So I would say that in this moment, as we are doing one of those momentous, 3 steps forward to be followed, of course, perhaps by several steps back, I'm thinking of coming out of slavery and then going into Reconstruction and then going into the era of Jim Crow, that in this moment, we are stepping forward. Many of us have stepped into Buddhism, and that developing a Buddhism that is appropriate and in the vernacular of Black people may require, for some times and some people, all Black Sanghas, so that we can deal with our own healing in our own way. And there is great, great, great diversity in the African diaspora. So it's not that we give up diversity, it's not there's monolithic Blackness, but I think this is a moment to explore that. Thank you.
Thank you. Just you mentioned Ambedkar, one of my favorite people, is that when he did that mass conversion and took on the 5 precepts, he actually gave his people 22 more precepts, which was specific to their Hindu culture, because he knew that if there was going to be liberation, there was certain stuff that they needed to do. And it was like, throw out your gods was one of them, so that was how he made the Dharma culturally specific for his people so that they could liberate and have emancipation. Yeah.
As you were talking, Arisika, I was thinking about how people of African descent have transformed every spiritual tradition we've come to, or that's been imposed upon us, right? That, that we have transformed in terms of how we pray and how we work sound and tempo. And I think that spaces for Black folks to meet in Sangha really actually facilitate that. And so it may really be the time for Black and Sandhas. And of course, we've got BIPOC practices coming up. We've got, spaces where people can actually heal, can talk about the harm, the wounds that are specific to living in a white supremacist space. And that is, I think, one of the most beneficial, really, aspects of Buddhism, whether you're practicing individually, or in a Sangha, to actually heal. And in the group, we get to see, again, we're reminded, it's not just me who's experiencing this, right? I'm not the only one. And so I think, yes, I think that is happening in spaces. And we'll then get to see what grows out of that.
So one question that comes up for me while I'm listening to Arisika and Karla give us so much wisdom on this topic is that I just think back, and I hate using this term, but I can't think of another way to describe it, but ethnic Buddhist communities. So Asian communities who brought these teachings to the West and passed them into the American diaspora. And what a lot of people kind of skip over is the fact that the reason that these Japanese communities, these Cambodian communities, these Chinese communities were so insular was because they weren't welcome in other places. So it wasn't them trying to selfishly keep this for themselves. It was just them trying to survive, right? It wasn't that long ago that Japanese people were put into concentration camps just for being Japanese American. And I think we should point out that didn't happen to Germans who lived in the United States at the time. So I'll just leave that there. But the question that should be being asked, if people are asking for a Black affinity group in the Sangha, is why are they asking that question? You know, what's happening in the larger Sangha where they don't feel safe? And again, going back to this idea of karma and us not wanting to sit with it, I think a lot of people push back against this idea of Black affinity groups and Black Sanghas because, you know, we're supposed to be all one happy family, and we are, clearly. That's what the Dharma teaches. But if people don't feel that way to the point where they want a people of color Sangha, then the question shouldn't be put to them, why don't you want to sit with us? The question should be, why don't you feel safe enough to sit with us? So that's the way the question should be approached, I think, by any Buddhist community who's facing this.
Thank you. As we begin to wrap this up, I'm going to give you another minute, and the minute is, what would you like the readers to take away from the book Afrikan Wisdom, which you are part of? What do you want readers to go away with? And I just say readers in the big sense. What do you want the audience to walk away with?
What came up for me is I want audiences to recognize the many voices and perspectives of Afrikan wisdom. I want people to be curious and seek out more. And for those to even feel a little discomfort in seeking out more. And I want people's hearts to be touched by the words in this book.
Thank you.
I think I want people to be touched by both the trauma and the resilience of peoples of African descent. I want people to, we have a list of ground rules for multicultural interaction at East Bay Meditation Center where I teach. And one of them is try on new ideas, think about them. The book begins with an essay about the African lineage roots of the historic Buddha. And this for many people will be a new idea. Some people may find it uncomfortable. But again, to be open to new ideas and new perspectives. The idea that the Buddha in some statuary, some iconography, has this really curly, kinky-like hair. And one of the legends is, the Buddha was meditating bareheaded and it was really sunny and all these snails migrated to his head. And that's why he is depicted with kinkyish or tightly curled hair. Now, as an African American who, somebody referenced Egypt in the beginning, I think Ivan van Sertmer, but one of the, Afrocentrists says, it is easier for some people of European descent to believe that aliens came down from the sky and built the pyramids than to believe that peoples in Africa, where the pyramids are located, where they are depicted building the pyramids, actually built them themselves. And so the idea that, he has kinky hair, people do have kinky hair, and it's the snails, has always not sat well with me. And so the idea of trying on ideas that may seem a little strange, being open to them. You don't have to necessarily accept them, but to be willing to try on ideas that are grounded in the perspectives of people from a different socio-cultural positionality. That's important. So I'll stop there.
I think what I want people to take away from this book is that our cultural identity and our spiritual identity are not separate. that they inform each other, that they enrich each other, and that we can bring all of ourselves to the practice. We don't need to leave anything at the door.
Thank you. I think what I would like in it, it's something that you said, Arisika, is I want to center African wisdom more. I want to talk about intergenerational wisdom, because pre-enslavement, we had a lot of wisdom, and that wisdom is a lot longer than the 500 years of enslavement. And so I really want to center that. And yeah, as you spoke about Buddha and the snails, I'm like, what the, you know? And in fact, there's something that just very recently, a friend who trained in the Shangpa Kagya tradition, and the person who put that lineage together is Nguma, the wife or the partner of Naropa. And she's recently found all this information where she's called the Black Dakini, the black, and very much black, you know. And so, yeah, she may have been born in India, but what's the roots of Nguma? You know, and this African Dakini, you know, and I was saying it, I mentioned it, and somebody wrote to me and said, but here, look, she's white or whatever. And so I was able to send the sources to them and say, well, here you are, she was black. And we know, you know, at some point after we're dead and buried, people are going to be saying, guess what? Did you know that Michael Jackson was black? Do you know what I mean? It's like how, you know, part of us have been lost. When you go to Egypt, why don't they know that it was the Africans? Because they went along, that the Arabic people went along and broke the noses, our Negroid noses, of some of the pharaohs, just to try and wipe us out. And we are here, just as you can see the four of us here, we are here, and we are part of the wisdom teachings. Yes, we are here, and we stand on the shoulders of the ancestors, and we are future ancestors. And this book is leaving a legacy behind us. Yeah. Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you.